Well, believe it or not, everybody, we are done with the first two parts of class. Congratulations. And we're starting up on part 3 with the topic of the French and Indian War. Now, you may have some recollection about this from your 8th grade year, but then again, how much do you remember from 8th grade? I'm going to go from the launching point of people don't know anything. And I started class with one of my favorite drills at 10 and 10. Gave people 10 minutes to find out at least 10 facts about the French and Indian War, and then we pooled it all together on the board, kind of a little hors d'oeuvre before the entree. So that was our launching point. Then I asked the people about George Washington. I asked everybody, George Washington, what comes to your mind? Here's the common answers. They get, oh, he was the first president. That's the, image they have in their heads, this old guy. Some people say the dollar. I think of the dollar, the quarter, Washington State, Washington, D.C., Washington Monument. All good answers, don't get me wrong. But very few, if anyone, thinks of George Washington as a young, athletic, early 20s with a musket in his hand. This is not the image that people think of about George Washington, but this is where George Washington learned his craft. It was from the French and Indian War as a young guy in his 20s. And I will say this, George Washington deserves all the accolades, all the hoopla, all the stuff named after him on the currency. I will pose the argument, no George Washington, no America. He is that important in my mind. But we'll talk more about George Washington. It is a U.S. history class, so we'll be talking more about George Washington. But through the lens of the French and Indian War, George Washington began with a commission as a major in the militia in Virginia. And in 1753, Washington was sent as an ambassador from the British Crown to the French officials and Indians. Now, this is where he cut his teeth and learned his skills that he used to lead this nation as a military leader and president. So that's how George Washington learned his craft, okay? And I'm posing a question, or I posed a question. How was 1763 a historical turning point in British colonial relationships? Very AP question. I can see this being on your test in the springtime. It's that sort of thing. So let me start off with North America in 1750. I know you've seen this before, and you can see the heavy hitters. There's really 3 heavy hitters. I mean, the Russians are doing their things here in Alaska, but British, yellow, bang, boom. Okay, French, big. Spanish, down the south, Florida, South Texas, Mexico. So you can see there's 3 heavy hitters in 1750. 15 years later, it's going to look a lot different. It's a very tumultuous, very fluid story that you're about to see, okay? So in 1754, the first clash happens in the Ohio Valley, okay? And it's between the British and the French over Fort Necessity and Fort Duquesne. Okay, there's Fort Necessity, there's Fort Duquesne. You see, blue French, red British. And they clashed. Okay, this is kind of the match that lit the bonfire. So this is where the tumult, the conflict begins in 1754. And this is a repeat from yesterday. But as this happens, we have this Albany Plan of Union, which is really focused on a lot in your book. So it leads me to believe it's something we should focus on. And we have Benjamin Franklin and representatives from New England, New York, Maryland, and Pennsylvania that get together to unite, okay, and there's their flag, join or die. So we start seeing the seeds of unity. And with the Albany Congress, failed Iroquois broke off relations with Britain and threatened to trade with the French, okay? So here, the plot thickens, the story thickens, okay? A year later, 1755, the British decide to eliminate French presence in North America. And we have General Braddock, and he evicted the French from the Ohio Valley and Canada, okay? Attacks Ohio Valley and Acadia, which is in the northeast part of the country. And he was killed 10 miles from Fort Duquesne by 1,500 French and Indian forces. So it did not end super well for the British. The only thing you could say is that they expelled the French from Louisiana. French Louisiana, it's called Cajuns. Maybe you've seen that show on the History Channel. There's Troy Landry, killing the alligator. It's called Swamp People, and that's they have the accent. You very well may not know anything about Cajuns, but anyway, that's a little aside there. Okay. Now in 1756, war is formally declared. Now some people say 1754, some say 1756. It's in that ballpark. Okay, but technically it was formally declared in 1756. And here we go again. We have Lord Loudoun versus the Marquis de Montcalm. All right, little Detroit connection. This is the intersection of Woodward and Montcalm. Yes, Montcalm Street is named after this, just like Lafayette is named after the hero of the Revolutionary War. Bear in mind, Detroit was Detroit. Okay, we still have a little bit of our French flavor. The fleur-de-lis is still on our city's flags. And the Native Americans are saying, okay, what's the best deal for us? Okay, so they had to really ask themselves, how can we benefit from this? And they tried to improve their situation and work both sides, that sort of thing. Okay, now this is a pretty fat slide here, but the point of it is real different ways of going about things. You look at the colonials and you look at the British. Now the colonials use this guerrilla style, strike and run, strike and run. That's what you do when you're a weaker army. You have to do it that way. The British, very formal, formation, orderly, organized. Okay, in terms of organization, the colonials had militias that served under their own captains, where the British officers wanted to take charge of the colonials. Now, in terms of the colonials, weren't real disciplined. Okay, again, it's a guerrilla style fighting where the British, they drilled and drilled and drilled to have that organization. Now, in terms of finances, the colonials were resisting the rising taxes. As Big Worm said on Friday, you mess with my money, you mess with my emotions, and that's what they were feeling that right there. The British said colonists should pay for their own defense. And the colonials were kind of non-professional, casual, where the British officers were very buttoned up, with tea and servants and that sort of thing. So real different vibe in the two sides. Then we get to 1757 with William Pitt, and he becomes a foreign minister. Now, he understood colonial concerns. He really did. He offered them a compromise. He said, hey, listen, you give us loyalty and military cooperation, and we'll take care of you in the pocketbook. Okay, we'll reimburse colonial assemblies for their costs. And we'll get rid of Lord Loudoun, will be removed, okay? Now, the results, morale did increase. Colonial morale said, okay, this is good. This is a positive. Thanks, Pitt. We can live with that. And then we see the tide turns for England, okay? So what we see happening is that the British are gaining ground. They're improving their situation here. Notice I'm speaking to you in English and not French, okay? That should give you clue enough. And by 1761, Spain has become an ally of France. So just in a short time, things have changed quite a bit. And then 1763, the Treaty of Paris. Now, for France, they lost her Canadian possessions, most of her empire in India, and claims to lands east of the Mississippi River. Okay, it was not a great gig for France. Now, for Spain, they got all the French lands west of the Mississippi River, New Orleans, but they lost Florida to England. So it's a mixed bag for Spain. France, not so much. Spain is a mixed bag. England made out pretty well. They got all the French lands in Canada, exclusive rights to Caribbean slave trade, and commercial dominance in India. And the British wound up ruling India for close to 200 years. Okay, so if you look at these three sides, England made out the best, Spain made out second best, France did not make out very well at all. Okay, now if you look at 1763, look at it here. Now this big, huge yellow block, this belongs to the British now, okay? And you can see that the French, not so much. So there they are. And then the Spanish were doing their thing, and the Russians are still doing their thing in Alaska. So I'm going to juxtapose this with 1750. 1750, wow. 1763, oh, okay. So France, again, did not make out very well, okay? Now, the effects of the war on Britain, it increased her colonial empire in the Americas. I mean, clearly. Hold on. Boom. Okay. That's an understatement, okay? So it really did increase her colonial empire in the Americas. It greatly enlarged England's debt. Britain's contempt for the colonials created bitter feelings, and you can guess what happens in a few years based on that. Therefore, England felt that a major reorganization of her American empire was necessary. Did not exactly work out well for Britain in a couple decades after this, okay? Now, in terms of the effect of the war on the colonials, it united them against a common enemy for the first time. That's important. It created a socializing experience for all the colonials who participated. It created solidarity. It created this connection with one another. It created bitter feelings toward the British that would only intensify. All right? Now, in terms of the frontier, we have Pontiac's rebellion in 1763. Yes, Pontiac, Michigan is named after him. Okay, so there were more tensions along the frontier, Fort Detroit being one of those, and the British gave the Indian smallpox infected blankets. Not very nice. That's a pretty rough aftermath. And Pontiac attacked. Okay, Pontiac rebellion. Hey, notice that's where Pontiac is. Wow, look at that. Great. Right there. Okay, so you can see these attacks by Indians all over the place. So there was a backlash. The Indians fought and fought and fought. You can't blame them. You can't blame them, but they did. And you can see this backlash. The British have this proclamation line. Here, drew a line in the sand. And then there was a group of colonials called the Paxton Boys that started vigilante attacks on Indians, and they lumped all Indians the same. Essentially, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, which is a precursor to these Indian wars that were brutal and long-lasting. But we'll get into those. And for the first time, many colonists began calling people who joined the non-importation movement patriots. So we see this first mention of the word patriots. Okay. So to end class, there are 7 questions here. They are also on Google Classroom. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to answer these 8 questions. Pardon me, 8 questions. And if you do that, it is all good. And again, all of the questions are on Google Classroom. And this question 8, using the Mount Vernon site, that is linked on Google Classroom as well. All right, so welcome to part 3, and kind of an interesting story. Back and forth, lots of drama. And that is the French and Indian War. So thank you for watching.